good to see you all out this morning. I want to start off certainly thanking Craig and Tip for the opportunity to fill in for Jerome this morning. Hopefully you don't leave missing him too badly. I'll do my best. But certainly appreciate all the work he does on a continuous basis in order to provide lessons. But what I'd like to do this morning, and one of the reasons I'm particularly thankful for this opportunity, was take some time to spend reading through the chapter that the brother started for us in 2 Kings chapter 5. And I'd like to pick up in that chapter because what we see in 2 Kings 5 is this fascinating story of cleansing. And we see this man Naaman who's coming from outside of the people of God. And he's coming and he's now bringing forth this problem. He's bringing forth his own ailment for a resolution. And we see a fascinating cast of characters come together in order to deliver the cleansing power of God. And what I'd like to do today is look at how four of the people in this story, specifically the servant girl, Naaman, Elisha, and then Gehazi, all play a unique role in teaching us about the role of a servant and how we go about carrying out the work in God's kingdom. And also, if you haven't noticed, I'm very thankful for Craig. He picked songs that directly tied into the lesson today, because that's exactly what we want to talk about, is how do we go about the work? How do we perform our duty as a servant of the Lord in order to carry out his mission? And so first, if you'd open up your Bibles to 2 Kings 5, we'll pick up in verse 7 and we'll finish out the chapter here. And it says, "And when the king of Israel read the letter, he tore his clothes and said, 'Am I God to kill and make alive, that this man sends word to me to cure a man of his leprosy? Only consider and see how he is seeking a quarrel with me.' But when Elisha, the man of God, heard the king of Israel had torn his clothes, he sent the king, saying, 'Why have you torn your clothes? Let him come to me now, that he may know that there is a prophet in Israel.' So Naaman came with his horses and chariots and stood at the door of Elisha's house. And Elisha sent a messenger to him, saying, 'Go and wash in the Jordan 7 times, and your flesh shall be restored, and you shall be clean.' But Naaman was angry and went away, saying, 'Behold, I thought that he would surely come out to me and stand and call upon the name of the Lord his God and wave his hand over the place and cure the leper. Are not Abana and Pharpar, the rivers of Damascus, better than the waters of Israel? Could I not wash in them and be clean?' And so he turned and went away in a rage. But his servants came near and said to him, 'My father, it is a great word the prophet has spoken to you. Will you not do it? He has actually said to you, wash and be clean.' And so he went down and dipped himself 7 times in the Jordan, and according to the word of the man of God, and his flesh was restored like the flesh of a little child, and he was clean. And then he returned to the man of God and all his company, and he came and stood before him, and he said, 'Behold, I know that there is no God in all the earth but in Israel. So accept now a present from your servant.' But he said, 'As the Lord lives, before whom I stand, I will receive none.' And he urged him to take it, but he refused. And then Naaman said, 'If not, please let it be given to your servant 2 mule loads of earth. For from now on your servant will not offer burnt offering or sacrifice to any god but the Lord. And in this manner may the Lord pardon your servant. And when my master goes into the house of Rimmon to worship there, leaning on my arm, and I bow myself in the house of Rimmon, when I bow myself in the house of Rimmon, the Lord pardon your servant in this matter.' And he said to him, 'Go in peace.' But when Naaman had gone from him a short distance, Gehazi, the servant of Elisha, the man of God, said, 'See, my master has spared Naaman the Syrian, and not accepting from his hand what he brought. As the Lord lives, I will run after him and get something from him.' So Gehazi followed Naaman, and when Naaman saw someone running after him, he got down from his chariot to meet him and said, 'Is all well?' And he said, 'All is well. My master has sent me to say that there just now have come to me from the hill country of Ephraim 2 young men of the sons of the prophets. Please give them a talent of silver and 2 changes of clothing.' And Naaman said, 'Be pleased to accept 2 talents.' And he urged him and tied up 2 talents of silver in 2 bags, and with 2 changes of clothing, and laid them on the 2 servants, and they carried them before Gehazi. And when he came on the hill, he took them from their hand, and put them in the house, and he sent them in away, and they departed. And he went in, and he stood before his master, and Elisha said to him, 'Where have you been, Gehazi?' And he said, 'Your servant went nowhere.' But he said to him, 'Did not my heart go when the man turned from his chariot to meet you? Was it a time to accept money and garments, olive orchards and vineyards, sheep and oxen, male servants and female servants. Therefore, the leprosy of Naaman shall cling to you and to your descendants forever. So he went out from his presence, a leper like snow. So thank you for bearing with me. I know it's a lengthy reading, but I think it's important to start off understanding the entire story. And that's a theme today. We did it in the class to start off this morning too. So we're gonna read through the whole text. But as you can see, as this plays out, there are several movements here as these characters enter and exit out of this narrative. And we begin to understand that each of them is playing a very unique role in how we get to the ultimate cleansing of Naaman and then how we get to the punishment and the judgment of Gehazi. And so to start off, the first character that really comes into focus and starts to stand out is the smallest of them all. So we have the servant girl. And so if you look back at the beginning of the chapter, in verse 2, it says that now the Syrians on one of their raids had carried off a little girl from the land of Israel, and she worked in the service of Naaman's wife. And she said to her mistress, "Would that my Lord were with the prophet who is in Samaria. He would cure him of his leprosy." This is the sum total of everything that we know about this young servant. This is it. And yet, in this moment, in this story that involves kings and mighty warriors and prophets and miraculous curing, remember, none of it happens without her being the catalyst event. None of it happens without her initially pointing Naaman towards the servant of God. And I think there's a critical lesson in that, which is that there is no service too small in the kingdom of God. That we are never so insignificant that we are unable to do work to the benefit of his kingdom. This girl had every opportunity to be bitter. She had every opportunity to refuse to help. What's just happened to her? A band of this man's men have come into her town, have kidnapped her, have probably laid waste and pillaged her city, and she's now been forced into servitude for his wife. Our modern sense of justice would never allow us to want to just naturally look kindly on this man and say, "Oh, I want to help him. Oh, I want to do something good for him." That's not her response at all. Her response is, she sees this man in agony and she says, "Oh, there is a prophet in Israel. Oh, there is a man of God who can help this." This is what her heart longs for, and I think it's the innocence of a child, if you will. It's just the purity of a child that can look on someone who is suffering and say that that person, regardless of who they are, regardless of the circumstance, is worthy of receiving help in that moment. And that's the beauty of her role in this story, is that she sees it, she has compassion on him, she's willing to extend the hand. And are we willing to do the same? You know, so often we go through life and we run up against personalities that we struggle with. We run up against situations in which we find opportunities to maybe clash with another person. But how often do we truly step back and take a moment to appreciate that the person that we're now at odds against is a person that's just as much in need of the saving grace of our God as we are? That it is a soul that Jesus went to the cross for just as much as us. And that we have an obligation and we have a duty to allow him to shine through us into their life. It's not lost on this little servant. I know it's only 2 verses, but we can see her demonstrating this perfectly to us. Which is that we wear the name of Christ and we wear it for every single person we come into contact with, regardless of what they have done to us, regardless of how they have hurt us, and regardless of whether or not we may feel in our own limited human rationale that they are worthy of it, because they are. God said that they are worthy. God deemed them worthy by sending his Son. And now, just like this young servant, we ought to be offering up that hope. But then look at the hope that she offers. Does she go into detail about who Elisha is? Does she go into detail about where exactly to find Elisha? How exactly Elisha is going to do it? She doesn't. That's not her job. That's not her role in this. What does she do? She plays her part and shares what she can about what God is going to do through his people. And it's something that we have to understand as well, which is that we don't have to do it all. That's not what we've been called to do. We've been called to allow ourselves to be changed by the redeeming power of Jesus, and then from there we are going out and we're shining that light. And you know what? Just as Paul writes in the New Testament in 1 Corinthians when he's talking about the fact that he's planting, Apollos is watering, but who's giving the increase? God is. This servant girl understands that her part to play is just to point Naaman in the right direction. It's not to provide something beyond what she's capable of. It's not to provide something that she's unable to do for him, but instead, she knows that there is a prophet and she knows he's in Israel and she's going to point him that direction. And so in our life, the question is, it's so easy, that's kind of the tried and true cliche that we will say that, well, I don't want to start a conversation because there may be a question that comes up that I don't understand. But I think even before that, are we willing to even invoke the name of Jesus? Are we willing to even bring up the fact that we believe at all? Are we willing to wear his name in a way that it is visible to others so that even if they don't ask the question, they can at least say, there is a follower of Christ. There is somebody that's at least willing to say that they have been changed by that. Are we willing to do the bare minimum? Because it should be a resounding yes is the answer to that question, but so often we're not. We want to hide and cover up who we are, what we believe, to the point that it's unrecognizable. And instead, you see this small young girl in a hostile and foreign land after being kidnapped and being put through absolute torment, willingly offering it up and saying that the servant of God is there, ready and willing to help you. And yet, if you can't tell, I think there's a whole lesson just on that one character in this. But it's a beautiful kickstart to this story and how she's getting everything set into motion. And now we get into Naaman. And to Naaman, he really represents the other side of that coin. Whereas she's not too small to serve, he's not too great to pursue obedience. He's not too great to recognize that he has an overwhelming need for God. And starting in verse 1, when he's first introduced, it says that Naaman, the commander of the army of the king of Syria, was a great man with his master and in high favor, because by him the Lord had given victory to Syria. He was a mighty man of valor, but he was a leper. And that phrase, if you're reading this with your Old Testament glasses on, you probably recognize the phrase, mighty man of valor, because it comes up from time to time, and it's a very specific phrase. And so if you're going back and you're looking for other references, you can see men like Gideon in Judges 6 are referred to as this mighty man of valor. Jephthah, also in Judges, and even David in 1 Samuel 16. They're given this title. In fact, it's so special, Naaman is the only singular Gentile to ever be identified using this phrase. He stands apart from all other people that exist outside of God's people as a mighty man of valor. That tells us something about who he is. And it's only further cemented by the fact that when he goes to his king and he tells him that there's a prophet, what is the king willing to help him do? He's writing a letter to a foreign nation that they've been at odds with. He's equipping him with tens of talents of silver and shekels of gold. By most accounts, this is in excess of $1.5 million in modern currency that he's been given to now go into this foreign land and to offer up his tribute in order to find the solution. Naaman was wildly successful. He had proven himself capable in a number of things. In winning victories, he had made himself a prized servant to his king, worthy of such a cost in order to buy his life. And yet, but he was a leper. And leprosy is such a fascinating biblical disease because, as most of us know, you have this, essentially this real-time decaying of the flesh, walking around as your body is breaking down day by day, falling apart, literally falling off at its worst extremes. And if that isn't the perfect analogy from a spiritual perspective of what we are, I don't know what is. Because lost and dying in our sins, we are walking around decaying in real time, severed off from our relationship with God, completely and utterly, desperately in need of salvation. And the question is, are we willing in that moment? Are we willing, when brought face to face with the fact that we are desperately in need of that help, are we willing to be like Naaman? Are we willing to say, I'm not above obedience? I'm not above recognizing that I am in dire straits and I need something greater than myself in order to get me through this. Because Naaman is. And he's willing to do that. And so he goes into this land. And then what we see is as he gets there, he recognizes that it's not going to always look the way he anticipates. He's this great man. He's going into this land. He's willing to go and pursue it. But, he's kind of already decided in his mind exactly what this ought to look like for him. And in a roundabout way, he ultimately ends up teaching us that we have to be willing to accept God's solution. And if you jump down to 2 Kings 5 in verse 12, the back half of that verse, it says, "So he turned away and he went in a rage. But his servants came near and said to him, 'My father, it is a great word the prophet has spoken to you. Will you not do it?'" And so what's going on with Naaman? He's gone to the king. The king has ultimately helped him get to Elisha somewhat. The king is actually so distant from God's people at this point, he doesn't even know where to find Elisha, but Elisha goes and gets him, brings Naaman in front of him, and now he stands there. And what's the expectation on Naaman's part? What does he think Elisha's going to do? He thinks he's going to come out, he's going to wave his hands, he's going to lay hands on him. It's going to be this large, dramatic scene, and he will be cleansed, right? And so he's probably envisioning something more along the lines of Mount Carmel, where you have fire coming down from heaven, and it's this large, spectacular event and demonstration of God's power. And yet this great, mighty man who works in the service of a king, who has just been able to walk into the court of a foreign king, is now not even greeted by Elisha when he gets there. Elisha sends out a servant and tells him to go wash in the Jordan and he'll be cleansed. And Naaman now is so angry, saying he turns away in a rage. But his servants actually help get him through this moment. It says, as they come to him, that "My father, it is a great word the prophet has spoken to you. Will you not do it? Has he actually said to you, 'Wash and be clean?' So he went down and dipped himself 7 times in the Jordan, according to the word of the man of God. And his flesh was restored like the flesh of a little child, and he was clean." So often in life, we can waste unbelievable amounts of time hoping and wishing that God's way were different, that it were easier, that it aligned to what we wanted. But we can kick against that all we want. It's not going to change anything. We may wish that God would speak down to us out of the heavens and drive out all doubt of his existence. We may wish that he would work great signs and wonders in front of us. We may wish that he would answer every single prayer as soon as it left our lips. But the fact that God does not meet our expectations in no way diminishes his power, his authority, or his goodness. And Naaman doesn't get it at first, but he gets it in the end. He understands going down into those waters and coming back up that he is now clean. He has now been saved from this horrible, debilitating disease, miraculously. And do we understand that through the blood of Christ, we are saved by something even greater? Because yes, his physical life was at stake here. But we walk each and every day with our eternal reality under threat, separated from the love of God. And that we have to understand that by going down into the waters and being washed in the blood of Christ, that we now come up, now being saved from decay, now being brought back into the loving embrace of our Creator. And again, it's not always going to look the way that we want. It's not always going to play out the way that we wish it would. But it doesn't diminish the fact that God has given us a solution far beyond anything that we could have ever imagined. And certainly beyond anything that we ever could have deserved. And finally, for Naaman, he also recognizes that obedience never creates a sense of entitlement. And while this is interesting because it's misplaced with Naaman at first, he's learning, he's going through this process of trying to understand and inform his new appreciation for God and who he is and what he is. The heart is in the right place. Because he comes up out of the water, and it says that then he returns to the man of God, he and all his company, and he came and stood before him, and he said, "Behold, I know that there is no God in all the earth but in Israel, so accept now a present from your servant." He is overwhelmed with thanksgiving over what has been done for him. What he's not doing is saying, okay, he told me to do this, I did it, good on me, I'm going home. This is not transactional. This is a deeply moving experience for him because he understands that he didn't deserve it. He understands the grace involved with receiving this type of a gift. And he allows that to motivate him to want to give back. Now, obviously, he's wanting to pay Elisha, which Elisha is about to just inform him that's not what God wants. That's not the point here. And it gets him to a better understanding of what that means, and that he should instead just understand that, again, he cling to the idea, there's no God in all the earth but in Israel. But is that the way that we respond to the gospel? Is that the way that we respond and live out our faith day by day? Because it seems that it can so often be a trap to where we say, well, I'm a pretty good person. I'm there more often than I'm not. I try to do what I can. Therefore, this whole Christianity thing, it's just kind of, I'm doing my part. I'm okay. But the reality is that we are constantly looking in the face of an overwhelming debt that we never possibly could have paid back. That we should be hungering and thirsting for righteousness because we understood the utter state of depravity that we were in. That we had been separated from our God and now are looking up at Him, calling out, begging for Him to save us from our enslavement to sin. And He did it. He answered the call. And just because we seek to do what we can to live out our calling in this life, that in no way makes us worthy of it. That in no way makes it to where we now deserve what He did for us. Naaman gets that. He's saying, I have all of this, just take it all, thank you. And again, it's misplaced, but it's the idea that should live within us. That when we look at our life and we look at the work that needs to happen here, when we look at the work that's happening in this community as we continue to try to spread the gospel, are we looking at the time before us, at the resources before us, and we're saying, here it is, God, take all of it. Take all of who I am, take all of my talent, take all of my time, take all of my ability. It is yours, it came from you, it's going back to you. Or are we saying, I show up on Sunday and Wednesdays, I do what I can when I can, and that's enough. I'm all right. Because it's two totally different hearts. And we know which one we ought to have. But we have to be willing to push ourselves to truly look into the face of what we've been saved from. And then from that, allow the thanksgiving to flow. The same way that Naaman is. Which brings us to Elisha. The rock of this story that everything kind of pivots around. And when we look at Elisha, the message, there's really two simple things that come from him. The first one is that he never compromises the message. It says, so that Naaman came to his house, came with his horses and chariots and stood at the door of Elisha's house. And Elisha sent a messenger to him saying, go and wash in the Jordan 7 times and your flesh shall be restored. But Naaman was angry and went away saying, behold, I thought that he would surely come out to me and stand and call upon the name of the Lord his God and wave his hand over wave his hand over the place and cure the leper. And just as Naaman came with all of his expectations and his wants and his desires of how this should look, there's also a natural temptation there for Elisha, which is to try to meet those expectations. Which is to say, okay, this is what he wants, so I'm going to try to do everything I can to make this, to package up the reality of who God is in a way that's going to be appealing to him. And there is a certain extent to which, Paul talks about in the New Testament becoming all things to all men, but it's never at the extent of compromising the truth of God. And that's what Elisha's willing to do. That we're not here in order to trick people into coming into contact with who God is. We're not here to try to dangle a carrot of some worldly thing in order to draw them in so that they can then start to appreciate what God has done for them. The reality is that we present who God is regardless of the expectations or the desires of who's coming. And we allow the goodness of our God and we allow the power of His message to move them to obedience. And Elisha understands that, and he understands it perfectly. That he's not there to try to impress Naaman. He's not there in order to be the one that moves him to believe that there is no God on earth except in Israel. He knows God's capable of doing that all on his own. His job is to play his part. His job is to put forth his effort in order to be a servant. And secondly, with Elisha, he understands that all of the glory in the situation belongs to God. And so, as we mentioned, Naaman comes back. He's misplaced in this idea if he wants to give to Elisha this gift. He wants to pay back what's been done for him. But Elisha understands that's in no way a reflection of Elisha or his power or his capability. Instead, he recognizes fully that the glory of this situation belongs to one singular entity, and that is the God from whom the power flows. That is the God who cleansed Naaman. That is the God whom Elisha serves. And again, this is something that we, as servants of God, have to understand. That there is only room for one person to be glorified in each and everything that we do, and that is God. If at any point we enter into service, if we enter into the work of God's kingdom, and we start trying to siphon off glory for ourselves, for others, we've already missed the boat. We've already failed before we've even begun. Because our role is to continually point people back to the creator and the sustainer of all things. Our goal is to point people back to the God who, before the foundations of the world, was already setting things into motion in order to save humanity. Our goal is to not get a pat on the back and a that a boy and a good job. And as soon as it becomes that, we have failed. We ought to be like Elisha and say, I'll receive none of it. I want none of it. But instead, push people to understand that the only power that is in our lives is the power that comes from the Father, is the power that comes from his word, that has changed us for the better and is capable of doing the exact same thing for them. And it's put into all the more sharp relief against the final character in the story, which is Gehazi, who fails to understand that there can be only one reward. And as he runs out, it says, but when Naaman had gone from him a short distance, Gehazi, the servant of Elisha, the man of the Lord, said, see, my master has spared this Naaman the Syrian in not accepting from his hand what he brought. As the Lord lives, I will run after him and get something from him. Gehazi is the polar opposite. This is the servant of Elisha. He's been there. He's seen him work miracles. He's seen him part the Jordan. He's seen him raise someone from the dead. And yet, in this moment, Gehazi looks at the situation and says, nope, I can be getting something more than just being a servant of the Lord. I can get something that's better for me than working diligently in order to bring about the Lord's will. And so he chases after Naaman. And as we finish out the story, we see the result. The result is having that leprosy fall back on him. But again, if at any point we look at our work in the Lord's church and we start to say, man, I don't feel like I'm getting anything out of it, we've already established the wrong mindset from the jump. So as we sit here today and as we look at the opportunities around us and we look at the people that work in this story, if we're really summarizing it all down, it comes back to we have to embrace our call. None of us are too great, we are too lowly, we are too capable or incapable in order to go about the work of the Lord. What we see here on a Sunday and a Wednesday is the smallest fraction of a percent of the actual work that's happening here, of the actual work that we are about. And that means that there are infinite possibilities for us to be involved in the Lord's work here together, day by day, diligently working in his vineyard. Whether it is doing the smallest thing behind the scenes or whether it is doing what we perceive to be the greatest, it doesn't matter because it all plays a part and it all works to the glory of God. And we should embrace it and we should rally around it. And when we continue to trust in his message, we can continue to go to his word and we can continue to believe and understand who God is and what he has made us to be about. We then go out into this world and we unashamedly present that to others. We don't change who we are. We don't work to try to make ourselves more appealing to the outside world by putting on bells and whistles and distracting away from the call of Christ. Instead, we embrace it all the more. We continue to work day by day to make sure that we are living it out, that we are being a living example of what he would have us to be as his people. And then in all things, we prioritize the glorification of our Father, because he is worthy of every ounce of praise that we can give him. He is worthy of every single fruit that we can help to bring to bear in his kingdom. Is this what we're willing to do? Or do we allow ourselves to be distracted by wanting the commendation of men as opposed to the profitable, fruit-bearing work of God's kingdom? So this morning, as we look at this story, we need to challenge ourselves to make sure that we're doing what we can to play our part, and we're doing it for the right reason. And if you're sitting here this morning and you haven't started to work in the kingdom of God, perhaps you're sitting here, you haven't taken the time to look at who Christ was, to understand what he did for us, and to go down into the waters believing that he went to that cross and he spilt his blood so that we might live. You have an opportunity to take advantage of that as well. Jesus is waiting with open arms, ready to cleanse us in a way that Naaman could have only dreamed about, cleansing us from the scourge of sin that has sat on humanity for generations, and to open us up to a hope of a home in heaven with our Father. All of that remains available to you. And if you are a servant, if you are a worker in the kingdom and you've lost track of what your purpose is, it's never too late to correct that. It's never too late to understand that we have an opportunity while we draw breath to work for our Father. And that if you forgot about that, there's nothing that we'd love more than to study with you, to work with you, to pray with you, so that we can all continue to edify and encourage one another as we go through this life and we work towards that home in heaven with God. So if there's any way in which we can assist you, please come forward as we stand and sing.